Hi, welcome to the second episode of Knitting with Color Loops. My name's Amelia, and I just finished a pair of socks that I really love. I knit them in honor of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and they use color loops, and it's also the first pair of socks that I have done partly by hand and partly on a sock knitting machine, so it's a hybrid. I wrote a pattern that I will post on Ravelry, and in that pattern I'll put all the directions to knit the sock completely by hand, and I'll include another section below where I say how I did it going on and off the sock machine. This is what the sock looks like, and it has quite a few elements to it. First I knit a cuff, and then I did one row of a setup round to make color loops, and then I turned the sock inside out and continued with the right side, extending the ribbing of the leg to sort of harken back to the folds of a judicial robe. I think that having texture in the black is an accurate representation of the black judicial robes. And then the sock architecture continues with some interesting features. In my hand knit socks, I like to do what I call an ankle snug, where I do 20 rows, 15 to 20 rows of slip stitch pattern along the rear portion of the sock. On the sock machine, it doesn't pull it in quite as much, but I did it on the sock machine this time, and it makes it so that you don't get a baggy ankle. Then I did a triangle short row section, just over 11 stitches, to make a little gusset at the ankle to deepen the heel and lengthen the leg. Then I used the normal short row heel on this sock. On the handwritten pattern, I stick to my favorite hand knit heel. I really prefer a heel flap and gusset heel. I just think it fits perfectly, so that's what I like to include for those patterns. And then I just continued on the sock machine and did a short row for the toe, and then on one sock I did Kitchener to graft it, and on the other sock I used the Finchley graft, which was my first time doing that, and I really liked it. So this pair of socks is pretty special. And oh, another thing that I think is very special about this pair of socks is that I was visiting my mother, and she brilliantly folded down the cuff, the leg, and it works just as well folded down. There you get the right side of the knitting. I prefer the back side of the knitting because you can prefer whatever you want. I think my mother would wear this pair of socks folded down, but I think I would wear it like this because I think this looks more lacy. You get more of the blips of the pearls that sort of make it more intricate looking. But I thought that was really interesting that I didn't notice that about this sock, and my mom did. The other thing that did, though, was it made me realize that I did something that I would do differently if I was knitting it again, and I think everyone should own a pair of RBG socks. And that is that on my setup round, I used the start of the white yarn and the end of the white yarn to make one of these color loops. It's not really a loop, it's two ends, but they knit the same way. They just wouldn't end without having, is this the sock that this one I wove in the ends already, but on this one I'll show you. I just brought the ends to the front of the front or back, whatever you want to call it, the stockinette side. And I was just going to trim them. I wasn't going to weave them in. But now I think I'm going to have to, because this sock may be worn either up or folded down. And I don't want ends to show. So if I were going to knit these again, and I will, I just have some more ideas I'd like to explore before I do that for other pairs of socks, that instead of starting and stopping the setup row with the white yarn, I would start in between a color loop and in between a color loop and make this also a color loop so that it could end without any weaving in necessary at that location. Instead, these two ends would be woven in along the setup row where they wouldn't show. So I think this would be a fun project for anyone who wanted to honor Ruth Bader Ginsburg or make a lace design on their sock. And it's got some interesting and maybe new features for someone to explore in their sock making. I'm going to show you how I did it, and I hope you enjoy the process. Thanks very much. Okay, got my setup sock started. I'm going to do a few rounds of waste yarn. Then I'm going to load my ribber. My ribber needles. Just need to make sure that the latches are open as I put them in. There we go. I'm just going to do a few rounds to establish the ribbing. Make sure all my latches are open. Okay, now because this is just the cuff and it's not going to have a front or back, I can do a little cheat and attach the okay. Now this out. And yep, gotta take the puppy out. Bjorn, you need to go out. You want to go wake up the boys, huh? It's playtime. Okay. Okay, now I've got one cuff pinned to the ball. I'll do that later. I'll do this one first. And I transferred the first cuff to some 1.5 US 9-inch needles. I think that's 2.5 millimeters. The easiest thing to do is to just flip the cuff so that I'm knitting in the right direction, and that's the nice thing about 1x1 ribbing. It is reversible. So now I'm ready to start the setup row for the color loops. And I have this sparkly white yarn that came with the Knitter's Brewing Company sock ensemble that I bought about a year ago. And I'm going to use a ruler instead of a rectangle to measure my color loops. I'm going to start out with a 1 foot approximate yarn tail, a little more, a little less. Oops. I'm trying to get a contrast color, so I'm holding this orange pillow on my lap because I'm wearing black pants and that won't be able to be seen very easily. I'm going to move my black yarn to the back. And so this yarn tail, as long as it's longer than a foot, I'm okay. So first thing is I'm going to knit 3. Now I'm going to do a color loop. So I start the stitch with my needle, but then I take my ruler and put that, prop that needle right on top of the ruler. And now I'm going to do a 2 foot color loop. So I'm going to wrap it around the ruler, pinch. So I'm holding it pretty tight because I want the yarn to be measured the same every single time. So I'm going to put that pinched location right where I'm stitching. Make that stitch without pulling the loop tight at all. And I'm going to do 3 more stitches. And then do the same thing, only this time I'm only going to go 1 foot. I'm going to alternate 1 foot with 2 feet all the way around every 4 stitches. So this is a 1 foot. I'm going to just pinch at the bottom of the ruler, come back to the top, wrap it around the needle, complete the stitch, and do 3 more stitches. That was a 1 foot, so now I'm going to do a 2 foot. Get my yarn ready. One, 2. It's easier when there's not a pillow on your lap, but this is just a 1 row thing, so even though it's a little fiddly, it doesn't last long. last stitch, 3. Oh, I know. This last one is the color loop, and it needs to be 1 foot long. So you end with 1 extra stitch because that color loop has to be stitched. So I cut that yarn. I'm done with the white yarn. I'm going to put it aside for the next sock. And now I have an octopus here with loop tentacles, and I'm going to put one of these stitch markers at the end of every loop. So I'll have, on this sock I'll have 15 of them. If you were doing a 72 stitch sock, you would have 19. Oh no, 17, sorry. So 15 and 17. So I'm just going to do that off camera. I'm going to put a hole. I'm going to make sure every loop has a stitch marker at the bottom. And then I will commence knitting with this black yarn around and around. And every time I come to a color loop, I will follow the design and knit until the color loops disappear. And I'll show you all of that. Okay, I've got the stitch markers on all the color loops now, and I've done my first 3 stitches. I forgot to start filming it again. I just wanted to get knitting, and I knit the first color loop, but now I'll show you how I do that because there are a couple little things that happen. So I knit 3, and this third stitch is really loose because it's got that long loop, right? So what I do is I tug on it a bit, tighten it up, grab its partner, and that should be your color loop. So you pull it a little tight, and in the next stitch you knit with it. So that tightens it up, and it makes it so it's not gonna stretch and pull so much anymore. Unless you're coming back from individuals to together again. So then I switch back to my black yarn, knit 3, and do the same all the way around. So this third stitch is loose, and I don't worry about it because I know I'm going to grab that color loop. So you see I'm pulling it tight, and I'm knitting with it. Whoops, I split the yarn. This yarn splits quite a bit. Okay. I'm just going to do that all the way around. When I'm knitting the design, I just follow the design for when the color loops are stitched. And as you come to them, you can tell which color loop you're knitting with. So it's not like, oh, I got a little tangled there. It's okay. That stops happening when the color loops get shorter. Oh, but what I was saying was that as you come to them, you'll be able to tell from the design and from which color loop you're approaching which color loop strand you need to be knitting with. So they don't, in this design, they don't ever cross. Sometimes they will join together, but they don't ever cross. So if I'm knitting a color loop on this next stitch, say, then it would be the one closest to it, and that would be this one. So it's not hard to figure out which color loop you're going to knit with, and then you do the same thing all the way around. It's a repeating pattern anyhow. So I'll continue doing this and maybe show you a little bit. I got a little dusty here. Show you a little bit when I get going on the pattern. I don't think I'll film the whole thing though. Okay, I'm back. That didn't take very long. I just did one of the color loops and realized that it would make sense to show you this. The short color loops are not in the second round of the design. They are not knit with a color loop. So those short loops are going to be a little loose, and you have to tug them tight again. And then the long color loops start dividing to do the diamond pattern. So this stitch, I'm going to take one of the arms of the color loop and knit with it. Then the black divides it, and then I'm going to do the second arm of the loop on the next stitch. So that's nothing and then divided, and do this all the way around. So that just is a good demonstration of how color loops can be knitted with or not. Sometimes you do have to do a little bit of tugging. So it's very easy. I split the yarn. There we go. And already it looks very jeweled. I think the more dark black your yarn is and the higher contrast with the white, the more this is going to have that lacy effect. Sorry, did that really slow. Okay. It all goes pretty similar to this now. You just have to pay attention to whether you've got a long loop or a short loop, so you know where you are in the design. And I'll check in when I get to the end of a loop. Okay, here I've got one cuff pinned to my yarn ball, and the other, I'm working on the other one, center pull, and I've got it right here, and you can see that the color loops hanging are only half as many now, because the short ones only have one stitch remaining. And you might think that's not even enough yarn to make a stitch out of, but it will just make a nice tight last stitch, and I'm going to show you how to do that. The locking stitch markers really are crucial, because it allows you to pull it without having to use your fingers on the very tip of the yarn, and it keeps that loop from unraveling. So now we're anchoring that final stitch, and it can be quite tight, but you actually want it to be tight. So I'll do that again. I lift it up, I put the loop over the needle as if you're going to do a long strand, only it's just that little bit, and keep that stitch marker on there. I'm going to get to the small part of the tip, and it's a little difficult, but I'm gonna, it's actually easier with metal needles. Okay, there, I've got it. That's the last stitch. Now I can take that stitch marker out, and that's the last stitch for that color loop. It's completely terminated. There's no more stitching to do on it. In the next round, it will be knit with the main color yarn. So I'm going to do that all the way around. Here is the longer color loop, and I've got the strand right there. I'm just going to knit with it. And the other side of the color loop. So that still has a ways to go. And I come to the next short loop, which is ready to be finished off. So I can take that stitch marker out. And taking the stitch marker out really does give it just a little extra room. So when I come around and I knit with the main color yarn, actually that stitch has plenty of space to be stitched. The tight tension on that last stitch is also good because this vertical line of stitching, as you pull it and shape it and block it and wash it, will loosen up a bit, and so you want that last stitch to be tight. So I'll just complete that, and I just wanted to share that last stitch. Oh, one other thing. When you get to the end of the round where it is yarn tail, then you want to move, for this design, not for all color loops, but for this design, you want to move your yarn tail to the front of the work, because the right side of the sock is actually the reverse. So you want your yarn tail to finish on the knitted side, not the stockinette side. I moved one of the yarn tails over on the last round because I want to finish that last stitch with just one strand. So after I finish this last stitch with this strand, I'm going to move it to the front. And then the two yarn tails won't be together, they'll be separated by one round, but that's okay. And I can leave them, they're not going to come undone. I'm going to trim them. I might tie a knot, but I'm not going to worry about weaving them in. That's a matter of choice. The whole point of color loops for me is that I don't have to weave in ends, so I'm not going to weave in the ends. But if you really want the inside of the sock to not have any remnants of hanging yarns, then there's enough length for sure to use a yarn needle and weave them in. You don't want them to go through any of these stitches, however, because this wrong side has the design that will be used for the sock. Okay. Now I'm going to continue terminating these short loops, and then I'm just going to keep knitting the pattern for the longer loops, and I'll check in at the end of those. Okay, here I've got the last row to finish just these last color loops. And I bring the tip over the inserted needle. I'm going to make sure it's not all crossed, because sometimes it does twist. That'll make it easier. That one's done. You can take that out. Okay, here we go. This is perfect. This amount of yarn is perfect because it's just loose enough to put over the needle. So that's a nice tight stitch. It's a nice tight end to the loop. So that amount of wiggle room enabled me to end all of these color loops on the same round. You might have to do some on one round and some on the next, because tension and measuring and all of that does make things different. So, okay, here's one that I knew I didn't have enough, so I made a single strand on this round so that I could end them all in the same round. So I'm actually knitting into a single strand, and then I'm ending with the end of the color loop. And that makes it look slightly different, but you would have to look really close. Okay. Oh, that was the first one of the round. So I do need to go all the way around again so that actually I don't have to. What I'm going to do next, I want it to be the same as the other sock. So actually I will go all the way around again because I think on the first sock I did that. And then I'm going to do about 5 rounds using a DK weight yarn so that I can transfer it to the knitting machine. Okay, here I've got my waste yarn, 5 rows, maybe a little more. I was knitting, just knitting and knitting and knitting. But I'm going to take my needle out. So for this sock design, I want this to be the right side. So I'm turning it wrong side out. And then I am putting it on the sock machine so that this is on the inside. I'm going to start at 9 o'clock, this needle. So. Okay, what I'm learning is that it's much easier to go from the purl side. You can see the purl bumps. So this is definitely easier. I can finish this really quickly. See how easy that is?